from Joe Weiss, and he's always got 25 jokes for me, and usually 24 of them are not something I can repeat in this class. But I'll try this one, and I'll see if this is the first time I'm telling this joke, so I don't know if we'll go over, but enough apologies. So there's this university in Oxford. I had the privilege of spending 2 post-doctoral fellowships at Oxford. Oxford is a beautiful town. I really enjoyed it. And they have this gorgeous carillon there. But it's a very, very difficult carillon to play. You know, it's got all these big bells in it, and you have to have tremendous upper body strength to be able to like, you know, pull the clappers and things like that to make the bells ring. So they've been trying forever and ever to get just the right guy. I am, but I'm just going to change a little bit, Joe. And they're trying, finally, you know, they have these auditions and all kinds of people come, but no one can really manage the huge weights of these bells. So finally one guy comes, this little Jewish guy, about, you know, he weighs about 98 pounds, and they look at him and they say, "How, you're trying out for this job?" He says, "Yeah, I'm trying." He says, "Well, okay, go ahead." And so instead of like grabbing onto the clappers with his arms, he takes a few steps back, and then he races at the bell, and he dives into it face first. Beautiful ringing sound that just resonates throughout the entire town. Everyone's amazed. And then, you know, they say, "Well, can you read music?" Sure, they give him the music, and he's going running around, banging his head right into each one of the bells. Perfect timing, and everyone is amazed. So they hire him, and he's doing really well, and he's having a great time there. And several weeks later, it's Purim, and he just overindulges a little bit, and he goes racing up to one of these bells, and he just misses his footing, and he falls out of the carillon, down several, you know, tens of feet to the ground, where he's lying on the ground stunned. And everyone gathers around and looks at him on the ground there while he's trying to wake up, and they say, "Who is this guy? Do you know him? Does anyone know who this guy is?" And someone comes up and says, "Well, I don't know who he is, but his face rings a bell."
That is so bad.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. If you want other jokes, you have to give me material. Okay. Tonight's class is truly amazing. I have to say, I spent a lot of time preparing this class, much more than I usually do, because it required a lot of thought to figure out how I'm going to just get this material over. And as you know, I teach a college-level class on Wednesday afternoons with undergraduate women, Orthodox women, and we went over this material today, and it was so amazing to see the range of responses. Some of the women were positively energized by the figure of the Maiden of Ludmir that I'm going to describe to you. Others were distinctly uncomfortable and were squirming in their seats saying, "Oh, can we get off this topic to something else that's fascinating?" I think we'll probably have a similar range of responses to Chana Rachel Webermacher and her rather amazing life. Tonight's class is generally sponsored by Eva Zachteweiser, who is in our community right now. Where's that? There she is. Thank you very much for the generous sponsorship. And also by my daughter Aliza, who she has a part-time job, and she is regularly giving her meiser to the shul so that she could sponsor this lecture. So we're very pleased for that. By the way, I'd like to mention that I did an analytics study of who watches my videos of these lectures, and it's amazing. I have like 7 people in Brazil, 19 Filipinos who are watching, living in Philippines, people in Sweden and Turkey, and it's crazy, all over the place. It's really quite exciting, and people are sponsoring from outside of, people who have never set foot in Bell Harbor, forget about this shul. So it's really exciting to see it kind of go global, and I encourage you all to forward the links when you get them to friends or former friends, and we'll make it a little more popular. The website is listed here, jewishhistorylectures.org. We're going to do some search engine optimization, so if you type in the words Jewish History Lectures, it should come up on page 1 of Google very soon, because there's not a lot of people who are doing this kind of thing, and I'm really very excited about it. But anyway, let me tell you about this amazing woman, the Maiden of Ludmir. She is known popularly as Habetullah mi Ludmir in Hebrew, the Virgin of Ludmir, or in Yiddish, Die Ludmirer Moed. Ludmir being a small town in Ukraine. I'll show where it is. The virgin epithet is a little bit of an exaggeration. Actually, you can't be a little bit exaggerated about those things, but as Nathaniel Deutsch, her biographer, wrote, she is arguably the second most famous virgin in Jewish history. Okay, dum-dum, right? Okay, so it's a fascinating topic. The problem with studying her life is primarily related to the sources. She's a 19th century woman living in a fairly backward part of Eastern Europe, and we have very, very few written sources. The first scholarly source that appeared about her life was only published in Yevreiski Starina in 1909, and that was fully, let's say, about 30 years after she died, and based primarily on very kind of soft sources. Hagiography, meaning like stories written, wonder stories about rabbis and things like that, which have sometimes dubious credibility, and folk tales and legends handed down from mother to daughter and mother to daughter about the amazing feats of the Ludmir Women. And if those sources aren't problematic enough, her life is so fascinating that it was picked up by many different playwrights, novelists, and so on. And so they've used poetic license to fictionalize her life, and then it becomes even more difficult to tease out what's actually true and what's not true. She's been the subject of 4 novels, 2 plays, and she was also an important character in a novel by Isaac Bashevis Singer. His Sosha is in part based on the life of the Maid of Ludmir, and also Ansky's famous play, The Dybbuk, has a lot in debt to the Maiden of Ludmir. So let's try and understand exactly. Oh, and one last really important thing. Nathaniel Deutsch, a few years ago, published the first really scholarly biography of her, and his research is just head and shoulders above anything that has appeared in the 20th century. Actually, it just appeared in the 21st century, but anything that's appeared in the last 60 years. So I am completely indebted to his research for this lecture. I'll have to put the link on the website so you can find the book. But this is essentially going to be one long extended book review because I'm relying completely on his analysis. Now, what do we know about die Ludmir Women? First of all, we know her name, sort of. It's Chana Rachel, although in some censuses she actually appears as Rachel Chana. We're positive it's the same person, but her name is sometimes transposed. We know her father's name, Monesh, and her family name is most likely Webermacher. Okay, that doesn't tell us too much. We know that she was born in approximately the year 1806. Some sources put it a little bit later, but approximately 1806, and that she is most likely deceased in 1888 in Israel and buried in the Mount of Olives there. We know that she led a life which was legendary for scholarship and piety, and she exercised a leadership role in a small Hasidic community in Ukraine. And much of her activity was associated with miracles, particularly with healing. The proverb was, when someone was sick, long after she had left Ukraine and long after she had died, people would wail, "Vu es die Ludmir Women?" Where is the Maid of Ludmir now? We need her now. And what's perhaps most fascinating about her life is that on a functional, anthropological level, she really was a Hasidic Rebbe. And if you look at what she did with her time, she had her own Beis Medrash. She had followers who came to her to listen to her Hasidic discourses, which she typically delivered, male and female, Jewish and non-Jewish as well, which she typically delivered from outside an open door. Like in one room of the house, everyone else would sit and listen through the open door. On occasion, she actually delivered lectures in the men's section of the shul while the men sat in the gallery and the women on the bottom floor. And she accepted kvitlach, she accepted, like little written petitions. She did the kinds of things that a typical 19th century Hasidic Rebbe would do. And in fact, there's a novel for young adults about her life, which is entitled, They Called Her Rebbe. Now, this is at the point where some of the girls in my class are starting to squirm and saying, wait a second, what kind of school is this we're going to? And how can she be a rabbi? And then I'm saying, well, what makes a rabbi? And they're saying, no, it's very difficult. Zohara.
How did she get started to find this gift inside of her?
Let's find out.
Okay.
How did she get started? So what happened with her? Okay, so here's where she comes from. Volodymyr Volynski. Here's a map of Eastern Europe in general. The Black Sea and the Baltic up here. And you'll recognize this is a contemporary map. So the Russian Federation, formerly the USSR, which also for a time included these states here: Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, and so on. The majority of the Jews in Eastern Europe, and actually in the world until the Holocaust, lived in this range of countries here. In terms of the Hasidic world, the bulk of Hasidim were concentrated here in western Ukraine, southern Poland. And if you look at a map of Ukraine itself, these are the various gubernii, or provinces of the region. Actually, this might be a Soviet map, so they don't use the same term, gubernia. And here it is in Volhynia. It's just north of the city of Lutsk. That's where she comes from, this small town of Volodymyr Volynski. It's a small town in the 19th century. The estimated population is less than 10,000 people, of which about 7,000 were Jews, which is a fairly typical profile for mid-sized villages of the era. Yes, Joe?
What was her motivation and how did she get paid?
Let's find out. And how she got paid is really important. But just patience, savlonas. We got to go just a little bit further. Okay. You know what? I have people complaining I take too many questions during the lectures.
Yeah.
So there we go. Any questions? No. Okay, so here we go. First of all, let's understand the historical setting of her life. I want to talk a little bit about the religious setting after that, which is going to be very important, especially when we come to apply the Abramson rule of history. Very, very important element in understanding how history works. And then we're going to concentrate on her life per se. So the historical setting for Jews happens to be a very, very dark period in Jewish history. It's the nadir of Jewish life in the Russian Empire at this time, particularly when Nicholas I comes to power. Here he's shown somewhat about a decade after his coronation.
No question.
I'm sorry?
Is that a real picture?
That is a real portrait. It is actually un vrai portrait, exactly. You got too many inside jokes. Come on, this is serious. What do you think, this is a game? So, Nicholas I, very military man, very much inclined to use the military whenever possible to quash rebellion and so on. In fact, he came to power after the Decembrist rebellion killed his father, and he suddenly came to power. He was not an anti-Semite in, let's say, the Hitlerian sense. He didn't want to eradicate the Jews, but he did take the Jewish problem very seriously. And what they mean, 19th century phrase, the Jewish problem, means what do we do with all these Jews? We're trying to develop a society, we're trying to shape it in a certain mold, send it in a certain direction, and the Jews aren't cooperating. Specifically in Russia, Nicholas I had three core values about Russia. He wanted it to be to believe in narodnost, which means peoplehood. Everyone had to have the same ethnicity. Orthodoxy, which means Russian Orthodoxy, that everyone really should be Russian Orthodox. And finally, belief in the autocracy, belief in the value of having a single leader, a Tsar, running the whole thing. So the Jews would go along with autocracy, and they would go along with orthodoxy, sort of. I mean, the Jewish orthodoxy at any rate. But the narodnost, the peoplehood, was a very difficult thing for the Jews to accept. So Nicholas I's strategy was to use the military. The Jews, historically, in the vast majority of European nations, were exempt from military service. This was primarily because the Jews really didn't consider themselves and were not considered citizens of the country. They were, in fact, in Russia, legally called transients. They had like permanent resident status, but they were not considered full citizens of the Russian Empire right up until 1917, the 20th century. But what they would do is Jews would pay a double tax to exempt themselves from military service, which was fine. The governments were good with it, the Jews were good with it, and it's a way that we maintained our group integrity. Nicholas I felt that the only way that he can assimilate the Jews and get them to start behaving more like Russians with, Christianity and so on, is if he forces Jews to accept conscription like all other peoples in the Russian Empire. Secondly, we should realize what conscription meant, though, in the Russian Empire. In modern states, Germany, Israel, France, whatever, if they have conscription, it's typically 2 or 3 years of military service. sometimes, as in Israel, followed up with reserve duty afterwards, miluim. But, you know, you take it when you're 18 years old, and you get it over with, and then you go on with your life. Military service in the Russian Empire was 25 years.
That's all.
So if you went in, that's all. It's not enough. So when you went into the army, that was it. You were a soldier for 25 years. It was not quite as bad as I'm describing, because in reality, it was a career choice for many young men. I mean, if they were, let's say, the second or third son in the family, and they didn't expect to get a big inheritance of land from their father, and they didn't want to become a priest, so, you know, the army is a reasonable career. See the world, you know, things like that. But Jews never opted for it. Nicholas I said, from now on, Jews must serve like everyone else. It wasn't universal. It was only a proportion of the male population. But if a Jew is chosen, he's got to spend 25 years. Now, if that isn't bad enough, he realized that by the time a Jew is 18 years old, he's already committed to his Yiddishkeit. Halavai, it should be that way today. But back then, by the time you're 18, you've had your bar mitzvah, you may be married, you've certainly had Chinese food a few times. You know, you're not leaving this culture. So he lowered the age of conscription to 12. And then he added the 6 years of military reform school called the cantons. These are the name of the schools. And so they could legally take a 12-year-old boy, put him in 6 years of military education. They were called cantonisten for this reason. And then afterwards, they'd serve their 25-year stint with the army, which is absolutely devastating. As you can imagine, huge conversionary pressures on the Jews when they were placed in these schools, and a lot of pressure to assimilate to Russian values. And in fact, most Jews who became soldiers simply were lost to the Jewish people. There's some fascinating footnotes about what happened to some of them later, but I don't want to go into it at this point. One more, I mean, it just gets worse and worse. Another horrible thing that Nicholas I imposed, which has a lot of connection to the Ludmir Women and her story, is that he placed the local Jewish communities in charge of deciding who would be sent to the army. It was not, you know, a lottery. It was not a democratic decision. It was a decision that was made by the Parnasim, the leaders of the community. And as you can imagine, once again, the Abramson rule rears its ugly head. The children of widows, orphans, the poor, travelers, those are the children that tended to be chosen first. And it generated a tremendous amount of internal dissent within the Jewish community as the working populations, the masses, began to say, what kind of leadership do we have up there? You know that poor Sarala, who lost her husband 4 years ago, her kid's going to go to the army, and not, you know, Rich Chaim. It's going to be someone who doesn't have power in the community who will be offered up to this modern Molech. But there was one possible out, which also had a lot of significance. Nicholas I did allow children who were enrolled in the crown schools to be exempted from the draft. The crown schools were Russian Jewish schools that had a very transparent aim of converting the children to Christianity anyways. So the choice was, if you were a Jewish mother, you could send your little boy to the crown school, where there would be priests who would be teaching him about Judaism, or you could keep your kid in cheder and hope that he would not be chosen for the army. A terrible, terrible decision that really was extremely corrosive to the Jewish community as a whole. And in fact, by 1844, the organized Jewish community, the Kahal, was officially disbanded by Nicholas I because it had ceased to function in any meaningful way. So this is the kind of environment with its socioeconomic pressures that are happening at the time of the Ludmir Women. Let me, I do have to pause for questions. A quick question I will take. Yes?
Most of the Jews were in the Pale of Settlement, correct?
Correct. All of the Jews, except for very exceptional people, doctors, and very wealthy merchants and so on.
So didn't he foresee that perhaps if he allowed them to get around there and get out of the Pale of Settlement?
It's interesting, and in fact, Catherine the Great, his predecessor by some 50 years, had hoped that, you know, if they gave the Jews more freedom, then they would, in fact, assimilate more rapidly to Russian norms. But it was not to be. And his approach to it was take a big stick and try to beat it into place. Mr. Kahlo.
Yeah, was there any, like, running away? Like, send your kids away?
Oh, The Jews tried all kinds of unusual things. Yeah, there was an exemption, for example, to only sons. So all of a sudden, childless couples suddenly were adopting sons from all over the place. So they were only sons. Jews changed their names to try to affect that. Jews shot their trigger fingers off in an attempt maiming themselves to try and avoid toes as well. Anything to try and avoid being conscripted. My own Zaidi, alav hashalom, he ran from the Tsar in 1904. He was slated to be conscripted to serve in the Russo-Japanese War, and he felt that even though it was much more proximate to high-quality Chinese food, he'd rather be... I had supper. Why am I talking about Chinese food? Okay, you know what? I got to pause. I'm going to go on with the lecture because this is so good. Now, that's what's going on historically. The most important thing is really this oppressive measure that lasts right up until 1917, but the intensity of it is 1825 to 1855. Now, religiously what's going on is Hasidism goes into a new stage of development, which is not necessarily its highest stage. In fact, it's considered a period of decline and desiccation of the Hasidic movement. If you look at this brief chart, you'll see that we're now into the 4th and 5th generation of Hasidic leaders by the time we get to the story we're going to tell tonight. The Baal Shem Tov, or abbreviated as the Besht, we spoke about him a few weeks ago. His dates are roughly 1700 to 1760. He has several students, the most prominent of which is Dov Ber, known as the Maggid of Mezerich, who dies in 1772. The 3rd generation are Dov Ber of Mezerich's students, 3 of whom established Hasidic dynasties in Ukraine and Poland, and 2 of which concentrate in Lithuania. In Lithuania, we have Shneir Zalman of Liadi, the founder of the Lubavitch movement, known as the Alter Rebbe, and Aaron of Karlin, the founder of the Karlin-Stolin dynasty. But over in the area where we're looking at, we have Elimelech of Lizhensk, who is considered the ultimate tzaddik in, again, the anthropological sense. What does a tzaddik do?
His yortzeit is tonight.
His yortzeit is tonight. Oh my gosh! Then we should say something nice about his yortzeit is tonight.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh! So the Noam Elimelech. Do you know a word about the Noam Elimelech? Something he said. They're Rebbe Elimelech, right? I'll see if I can think of something. I have a spooky story about him, but maybe I'll tell after the lecture's over. Levi Yitzchak Berdichev, tremendous stories about him, and I don't want to go into detail on it. And finally, Menachem of Chernobyl, whose dynasty is where the Ludmir Moed lived. Now, what happens when you get to the 4th and 5th dynasty? It used to be, particularly in the first 2 generations, who got to be a Hasidic Rebbe? Someone who was charismatic, someone who was an Ohev Yisroel, who loved the Jewish people. In fact, the Abter Rav was known as the Ohev Yisroel. Someone who could, lead people and be a great teacher and sometimes a miracle worker, things like that. That's what you had to do to be a Hasidic Rebbe. By the time you get to the 4th and 5th generation, the qualifications are quite narrowed. Basically, you have to be a son of a Hasidic Rebbe. So it becomes dynastic in rule rather than meritocracy in form. And this leads, as many critics have said, to a desiccation, a reification of the Hasidic movement, in which many of the Rebbes, in some cases, even abused their authority. Several of them establish massive courts where there's quite literally a tax on members of the Hasidic population, where they have to pay for the upkeep of the court. And in fact, they hosted literally hundreds of people twice a year, where husbands would leave their wives, Sukkot and Pesach, and go and spend sometimes months at the Hasidic court, where they would have to be fed, where they would have to be entertained, and so on. And it was really a big institution. It went from being, in the 18th century, small charismatic groups of people who were like really turned on and fired up by a particular Rebbe. And by the time you get to the early 19th century, some of these Hasidic dynasties, I won't say all of them, and I won't say which ones either, are noted for their bureaucracy more than their inspiration, shall we say. Okay, enough said. Now we should talk about the Ludmir Moed. I remind you, our sources are very complex and difficult to work with. Lots of oral traditions, lots of hearsay, very little hard, objective, verified data. So when I tell you some things, I don't have to say, some say it was because of this, some say it was because of that, and you'll just have to tolerate the reality. What we know about her is that when she was 12 years old, she visited the cemetery where her late mother was buried, and she passed out there. According to some stories, it was as simple as tripping and hitting her head on a rock. According to others, it was she was overwhelmed with emotion because she was engaged to be married. Not at all atypical for a 12-year-old girl in approximately, let's see, 1806, 12, about 1818. Yeah. But she was either hopelessly attracted to her chassan, and according to some versions, she could not handle the separation, the enforced separation before the wedding that she had to endure to stay away from her intended. But at any rate, she was most likely in the graveyard inviting her late mother to the upcoming chuppah, which is a very common tradition when she passed out. When she came to, some while later, according to some stories, she actually spent the night there, she was a completely different person. She, according to some versions, suddenly began to recite pages and pages of Talmud that she had never studied. According to others, she had simply decided to call off the wedding, which she did, and she just wanted to live alone and simply study and pray. And she wanted nothing else out of life. She just wanted to devote herself, as it were, in a unique and solitary manner to God. Her critics, later on in life, argued that she was the victim of a possession. The term in Hebrew is a devekut. It has a double meaning. The word dibuk means something that sticks. In modern Hebrew, devek means glue. So davak means to cleave, like cleave unto your wife, leave your mother and daughter, cleave unto your wife. So her critics said that a malignant, wandering spirit that was unable to go into the next world had somehow seized on this young woman and had invaded her body. A possession, in other words. This is, by the way, the model that Ansky used for his famous play of the same name, The Dybbuk, and you see one scene from a reenactment of it. However, you know, in Jewish thought, usually these dibbuks make a person behave badly, very antinomian behavior, very challenging to authority, and so on. She didn't do any of these things. In fact, she just sat and studied Torah. And she prayed with tremendous intensity, and she was like really a very special young maidel, just focusing on her studies and growing. Some of her proponents had said it was not a dybbuk, but perhaps it was an ibur. An ibur is a lesser well-known idea in Jewish mysticism, whereas a dybbuk is like a malignant, negative spirit, perhaps an unsatisfied spirit. An ibur is a higher spirit, and in fact, she referred to receiving a higher soul at that moment. It's like a higher spirit, like Rebbe Akiva or someone, who comes and, you know, infuses his or her greatness into a person, inspires them to do still greater things. The word ibur is the same root as pregnant, meaning added, value added, so to speak. It's a positive aspect of devekut. Now, we don't know, you know, all this is kind of in the realm of mysticism. We don't know what actually happened, but for sure, she was a changed person, and from the ages of 12 to 19, she lived a highly solitary existence. It could be, by the way, in terms of her marriage, that there's a lot more going on here. There are several legends that say that before she was engaged, her father was specifically warned by one of the Chernobyl Rebbes that he should not marry her off to anyone that she does not consent to, which is halachically problematic anyways, but, you know, as was common, there's a lot of parental coercion, certainly back then in the 19th century, where if the father chose a chassan, a groom, and she doesn't comply, there will be a lot of pressure brought to bear on her. But the Chernobyl Rebbe said, with your daughter in particular, don't even try. It's not a good idea. Another version says that on her deathbed, her mother had told her husband, whatever you do, don't pick a chassan for Chana Rachel unless she specifically approves him. So she certainly had a mind of her own and an idea about who she wanted to marry. There are various versions of who that first potential chassan was. Some say he was an adolescent friend that she became infatuated with. Others say that he was her childhood chevrusa, that they went to cheder together and studied together. You recognize the picture there? You can't see in this light, but that's Yentl over on the left, and her chavrusa there. Others say, and perhaps it was someone that her family used to have over for Essenteg, which is in the shtetl, the first yeshiva to have a dormitory was the Yeshivas Chachmei Lublin, which I believe was established in 1920, if I'm not mistaken. Before that, there were no dormitories. People had to, if they went to a yeshiva, they had to find a place to sleep, and they had to find a place to eat. So the custom was that many families would say, okay, Tuesdays we'll take one boy. Essenteg, right? Daily eating. Yeah, and it would be like kind of a depressing thing where you had to schlep yourself to this family, to that family, you didn't know what you were eating, and so on. And it was kind of a tzedakah, but it was not always offered so generously. But perhaps her intended was one of these yeshiva boys who came for Essenteg. And a third version, which I think is unlikely based on the dates involved, it was a runaway Cantonist that she had somehow fallen in love with. At any rate, she didn't marry this guy, and she went on to spend all her time totally devoted to being secluded with her books and so on. According to multiple accounts, she wore a talis and tefillin, and not only wearing tefillin, she wore Rashi's tefillin and Rabbeinu Tam's tefillin, meaning she wore 2 sets of tefillin, not simultaneously, but in order to fulfill every single opinion of how a person should wear tefillin, maximally, that's what she did. It is consistent with a Russian tradition that there were these women called Chernichki. Cherny means like black. So these are women who decided early on in their life they did not want to become nuns, and they certainly didn't want to become regular housewives. So they just told their fathers, that's it, not getting married. And the fathers would be duty bound to build like a little hut for them on the outskirts of the village, and these women would dress in black and lead solitary lives, self-identified solitary lives. It's not entirely unknown in the Jewish tradition as well, although we don't have the concept of a nunnery. We do have the daughter of Yiftach. If you remember the story in Shoftim, the judge, Yiftach, he says, you know, things went so well, I swear to God, whatever walks out of my home first to greet me, I'll offer as a sacrifice. And he's thinking it's going to be a cow or a chicken, and it's his daughter who walks out, and he says, oh my gosh, I already made an oath I was going to, bring that thing as a sacrifice. What do I do with my daughter? And essentially, she ends up becoming one of these recluse young women. You may wonder why I have a picture of Rosie the Riveter up there, famous war propaganda. Women can't do it. It's because I really like the second picture. Right? Okay. Now, this is where it gets really weird. You didn't think it was weird till this point. When she's 19 years old, her father passes away. Now, one thing that I've neglected to mention so far is that she comes from a fairly wealthy background. Right, Joe? It's all about the Abramson rule. She comes from a fairly wealthy background. So as soon as her father passes away, her mother died many years earlier, she gets the entire inheritance, and she says, okay, I'm opening up a base medrash, and she opened up a little shul. It was on the second floor of a building in this little town. It was called the Gorenstiebel, the upper story little house, and she just spent her days studying Torah, teaching Torah, and davening. Everything that she did was entirely within the boundaries of halacha. It's true, there are many poskim who say that women should not wear tefillin, but it's certainly an element of debate. There are rabbis who go back and forth about exactly those things. But she never, tried to daven in the men's section. There are some interesting stories that say that on Simchas Torah, what she would do is she would chase all the men out of the shul, and the women would take out the Sefer Torah, and they would all take turns kissing the Sefer Torah. Of course, properly covered in the mantle and so on. But she was really empowering women in a very unusual way for the beginning of the 19th century. Definitely in a way that challenges societal norms, but not directly contradicting any halachic definitions of behavior. She maintained a tish. Basically, everything you'd think a Hasidic Rebbe should be doing with his day, that's what she was doing. It's kind of like the joke, The president of the shul brings his young son over to meet the rabbi, and the president says, Rabbi, I'd like to meet my young son, Shmuel. This is the rabbi. And the rabbi says to him, Shmuel, it's really nice to meet you. Tell me, do you have any questions? And the boy says, yes, Rabbi, I'd like to know, what do you do all day? And the rabbi says, you're just like your father. But what exactly does a rabbi do all day? The things that Hasidic rabbis did, she did. She maintained a tish, which is, a table, and she would gather people around, and she would just teach Torah. Men and women, seated separately, everything, kadas kadin, and she would teach Torah. Sometimes, if she gave proper lectures, as I mentioned, it would be on the other side of the door. She would read kvittels. People would bring her petitions, which she would read. She would give blessings to them. She would have audiences with women. She never had audiences with men alone. And in fact, many Hasidic rabbis came to meet her. We'll see why they want to meet her soon. She refused to meet with important people. She says, what do you want to meet with me? And she would send them away, because it was a kind of a strange humility, with one exception, as we shall see. In every case, she maintained a strict adherence to tzniut, to the laws of modesty, always covered up, and she dressed in white, and an unusual character with a lot of this sort of rabbinic activity. Here's a few of her teachings. This is it. This is it for her 4 recorded teachings. She wrote nothing about herself. But let's just look at them quickly. The first one here, 1. A person whose holy thoughts accompany him on his life's journey is not alone and wretched, for the noble thoughts shelter him from loneliness. And I think, framed within the parameters of her life, that's an unusually profound statement. 2. Every pure thought that flows from the desires of the heart, the intellect is unable to grasp at all. We're just looking at these very quickly. I think that's quite a profound thought myself. It reminds me of something that Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote. And she came first. 3. Although I doubt Nietzsche read anything about it. Every moment of existence, yesh, is for itself. All that is in the present is no longer in the past, and if it was, it is renewed. I don't understand what that means. 4. A person who does not see the Holy One, blessed be He, in every place, does not see Him at all. So, interesting very interesting kind of thoughts. Okay, now let's go to his critics. Unfortunately, I have only the English translation.
No, everything was in Hebrew. Did she?
I presume she spoke entirely in Yiddish. When she moved to Israel, as we shall see, she may have had a following in Hebrew. No, it's probably unlikely it was in Hebrew then, because it's still early 19th century.
Those days, did
Mostly.
you speak Hebrew?
Yeah, it's most likely all in Yiddish, but again, I don't have the original languages. I don't have the text in the original. Now, as you might be presuming, not every Hasidic rabbi was thrilled with what she was doing at this time. And there was a lot of traditionalist opposition. But it was never head-on opposition, because it's very hard to actually find anything that she did that really transgressed Jewish law. Definitely Jewish custom, Jewish practice, and perhaps the most significant opposition was the fact that she refused to marry. That, what is she doing? She was, don't forget, she's still quite young. This is basically the decade of her 20s. From 19 to about 28 or 29, that's when she's doing these things. And she refuses to marry during the entire period. But if we look at it a little bit deeper, we see that she is really exercising a kind of leadership that has the engine of traditional Beshtian charisma rather than dynastic authority behind it. She is gathering followers because of who she is and what she's doing. She's not asking anyone for money. She's not asking anyone to even come. She's just offering Torah to anyone who wants to hear it. She's offering blessings. If you come, don't come. It's up to you. This is quite different from the institutionalized Hasidus that was happening, particularly in the region that she lived. And it was destabilizing to the status quo, because, and her following was overwhelmingly, by the way, working class, Balei Malacha, simple, humble Jews, who are working primarily with their backs and very simple menial jobs, that's all of the commentators emphasized that she did not have like an erudite professional following. She had common Jews as her following. There also was a significant challenge to the revenue stream, because if you wanted to be a chassid of one of the major groups, there was an enrollment fee, and there was a regular kind of, you were expected to give your pidyonos, what they called ma'amados, which is the term used for the upkeep of the regular sacrifices in the temple. You had to pay your ma'amados every month, and now here, she's not asking for anything. Because she's independently wealthy, she has the wherewithal to simply do what she wants. You want to join her, fine, and if not, also fine. And there's no doubt that there's a certain element of misogyny attached to all of this, that it's not right that a woman should have so much popularity and power when there are men doing the same thing. In fact, I think one of Nathaniel Deutsch's very prescient observations is that, there are a lot of Hasidic holy women, but every single one of them is somehow attached to a Hasidic holy man. And she's the only one who doesn't want to be attached to a man. Like the saying goes, a woman without a man is like a fish without a bicycle. I think it goes right. She doesn't need it, so she says, what's for? So at any rate, in her late 20s, she is finally pressured upon by the current Chernobyl Rebbe to marry. Showing genug. Enough already, it's time for you to settle down and get normal. According to the legends that we have, he debated with her, always with another man present so they would not have the problem of yichud, debated with her for 3 days, convincing her that she must marry, that it's not right. She ultimately consented, and they set a date for the marriage, and she chose as her chassan her own gabbai. Right? I mean, the gabbai of the shul that she owned, the guy who took care of who got the aliyahs and so on, he was to be her husband. And in fact, there was a big celebration, and she got married for approximately 24 hours, after which she sued for divorce. Now, there's a lot of different questions. Why did she marry only for one night? I'll try and sort out the various opinions and various legends that have been handed down. One of my favorites is that her gabbai was too intimidated by his wife that he did not want to consummate the marriage. I mean, she was the holy Ludmir Women, right? She was the maid of Ludmir, and so he refused to consummate it. Another theory is that no, in fact, she followed through. She did not want to be so antinomian that she disagreed with the great Chernobyl Rebbe. She says, you want me to marry? Fine, I'll marry. Look, I did it. I married. Now leave me alone. And she said, now I want my get. I want my divorce. And I don't want a ketubah. You don't have to pay me for the divorce. But just leave me alone, because now you have no more tainus on me. I'm married, all right? Another opinion is that, in fact, she did not ask for a get. She chose to remain an aguna, forbidden to other men. Because in that state, which is normally considered a very terrible, awful state for a woman to be in, she said, this way, no one will bother me. Finally, I will have no pressures whatsoever. At any rate, her marriage dissolved. She also completely abandoned her public role as a Jewish leader. According to many of the authorities, she felt that she had lost her powers as a result of the wedding. Some say, one of my favorite aspects of it, that as the Hasidic custom was at the time when a woman was married, she cut off all of her hair. And when she lost her beautiful red hair, along with it, like Samson, she lost her powers of prophecy and so on. I haven't even bothered telling you many of the amazing legendary stories of what she could do with it, but she apparently lost powers. For certain, however, she simply ceased acting as a rabbinic type figure for 3 decades. And she sort of disappears from the stage of world history. But she's going to come back. But maybe I can take a couple of questions before I do. I've given you a lot of stuff.
Where did she go? Where was she died?
Oh, we'll get to where she died yet. She's still living, though.
What did the gabbai do?
We don't know what the gabbai did afterwards. Well, the shtibel eventually went to the Chernobylers. It fell apart, and the very movement that was pressuring her to marry, they ended up inheriting the shtibel. And she stopped, having a tish. She stopped speaking in public. She just
Is
sat
there
back.
any data we can by her followers about her speeches, about her advisement?
Unfortunately, most of the data that we've recorded are written by people who heard it from people who heard it from her. And sometimes even more than one generation spread out. Again, the earliest source we have is 1909. She died in about 1888, and her period of activity in Volyn ended at about, I think, 1835 or so. So it's really quite distant. Now, it's spread out. There are all kinds of stories that go all over Europe, and there's consistency between them, so we know there's a kernel of truth to them. But we just can't get closer to the reality of the Ludmir Moed than the sources that we have.
So it means also that she didn't wrote anything by herself.
She left no written record, not at all. Yes, last question.
In reference to the Nicholas first, when certain Jews went into the army, do you have any information, Professor, they can reach a higher officer level bid to be a Jew, or they have to forget the Jewishness?
Now that's an excellent question, which I'll repeat in case the microphone didn't pick it up. Could a Jew advance in the army without officially converting to Orthodoxy? I'm not sure. I think, though, that there was significant upward mobility.
Because I have some information.
Oh, so what the famous captain who served in Israel at Tel Chai, Trumpeldor, yeah, was it Trumpeldor? Wasn't he a captain? Yeah, so that's quite a high rank. Now that was late. That's already 20th century, but I would say so. I can tell you two quick Cantonese stories, and then we got to get back. What is fascinating about the Cantonisten is most of them simply disappeared. They converted and they were lost to the Jewish people whatsoever. I did meet a colleague of mine at Columbia University at a conference once, and he's a Ukrainian, and he has this really Jewish last name. It was something like Goldstein or something like that. And I said to him, how come you have this Jewish last name when you're so Ukrainian? And he said, well, it's believed that my great-great-grandfather was in fact a Cantonist, and we don't know for sure. I mean, the Goldstein is, I think, a giveaway, but the fact is, the legend is, he walked into the village one day and he knew how to read. And the fact that he knew how to read made it much more likely that he was possibly Jewish. That's kind of interesting. Last thing about Cantonisten, and then we're going to go back to Ludmir Moed. The most fascinating Cantonist community, I think, are the Jews who ended up in Estonia. Because when you finished your term of duty for the army, even though you were Jewish, if you remained Jewish, you were exempt from the discriminatory laws that applied to Jews because you were a veteran. And so a lot of Jews who had served in the army, these Cantonisten, moved up to Estonia, which is way up in the northern section on the Baltic Sea, which is almost considered like a resort-type community for many Russians. And they set up these really interesting Jewish communities there, made up of people who had lost almost all their Yiddishkeit. They hardly knew anything, but they had hung on to their Judaism identity enough to create these amazing communities. And they lasted as Jewish communities right up until the Holocaust. Okay, so let's go to the last period of life when the Ludmir Moed has a fascinating renaissance. At the age of approximately 53, she decides she's going to move to Israel. And in fact, when the Chernobyl Rebbe told her that she has to marry, he said either marry or move to Israel. One or the other. I don't know what move to Israel, I guess, means get out of here, but move to Israel. So at the age 53, she in fact does it, which is quite, impressive in the late 19th century to schlep to Israel with all the difficulties. We're talking about the 1850s, late 1850s. And she moved to Israel, where she shows up in some of the census records of Moses Montefiore's community. And there she apparently gathered quite a following once again. She started wearing talis and tefillin again, living in Mea Sharim, not an easy thing to do. And she is referred to in the Montefiore census records as Harabanit Hatzadeket Mimishpachat Ram, which means Rabbanit is ambiguous. It could mean Rebbitzin, but it distinctly recorded in the census records that she does not have a husband, so that's unusual. Hatzadeket, the righteous one, which is, that's not usually a term used in those contexts. Mishpachat Ram, from an elevated family, from a wealthy family. So once again, she took her wealth and she set herself up in Israel, and she once again went into the rabbinic tishmot. In this case, she gathered principally women, and she was famous especially for taking several groups of women several times a year to Kever Rachel, the grave of Rachel, where she organized these rather unusual kind of prayer circumstances at the grave, and then on the road specifically, because in reference to the famous passage about Rachel crying for her children. And she's even noted, at that time, followers have noted that even Arab women went to her for blessings for ill children and things like that. So she once again kind of reached her deep within, and she found her inner rabbi and gave it over to the population as a whole. We have a record of a Rachel Chana, daughter of Monesh, from the correct region, who died in 1888. Her name is transposed, but it's most likely our Chana Rachel. And she was buried on the Mount of Olives in the late 19th century, bringing her rather amazing life to a close. So when we contemplate her life, and I want to remind you, this morning or this afternoon I had 5 19-year-old women, and their reaction to her were all totally different. Some were just energized and said, I never knew a woman could do things like this. And other women were saying, oh my gosh, this is terrible. How could they allow this kind of thing to happen? At the same time, what were the rabbis at this time? It's fascinating that she is a rather complex role model for 21st century women, even for 21st century observant Jewish women, because her life is really so unique. She was a leader of women. She was not simply secondary to a male figure, and she did it in a highly idiosyncratic way, which was certainly facilitated by the fact that she had the economic means to pursue her own unique path. She was really a Wolfian kind of character in that she had a room of her own, quite literally, to do whatever she wanted. And in that space, despite the pressures of society, she elected to essentially act as a Rebbe. She defied those social norms, but she remained really within the boundaries of piety. And I think in many ways she's an inspirational character for us looking at women in the 19th century. With that, I want to thank you as always for your great patience, and I hope you have an excellent week. I'll hang around if you have any questions. We'll turn off the video.